This is Liberty Law Talk, part of Liberty Fund's online library of law and liberty. Your host is Liberty Fund Fellow Richard Reinsch. Our web address is libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org. Today we are talking about the Declaration of Independence and its context in history with Barry Shain. Barry Shain is a professor of political science at Colgate University. Professor Shain, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Now, Barry, you have compiled, edited, and written a masterful introduction essay of a new book entitled The Declaration of Independence in Historical Context that Liberty Fund recently published. Why do we need this particular volume?
I think in part, the volume has several ambitions. One of them is probably as much as anything else methodological, and the other one is more narrowly historical. The methodological element is I'm trying to challenge, particularly the way political theorists reconstruct history. They tend to do so selectively and in ways which I think are just not in keeping and not consistent with the way most of us actually live. They tend to create a story which is based on the idea somebody writes a book somewheres and large numbers of people and movements follow the writing of a book. I don't think, in fact, that's the way life actually is. And I don't think, in fact, in the history of political thought, it's been it's an accurate mapping of what occurs. So part of what I'm trying to do is reconstruct a history of how the North American British colonists, at least a large group of them living on the continent, actually separated from Britain. And to do so, what I'm trying to do is put forward a different kind of history. Too often, political theorists in particular, historians somewhat less so, will construct a history based on cherry-picking of documents that they find congenial, and the ones that they don't find congenial, they leave out. This leaves us with a very difficult impasse, which is people have their different cherry-picked documents, and then they can compare them and oppose them to alternative views, and there's really no way to resolve or to find some way to question or at least to agree on what is the correct understanding. So this book is a strange hybrid between an anthology and a monograph. It's trying to argue that if we can take the most dispositive documents largely intact and take those that in fact are not selected simply because they agree with our position and use that as a foundation, maybe we can move to some level of a discourse where we can come to agreement or at least closer to it. So there's a methodological claim that political theory needs to develop a more rigorous foundation and a more rigorous approach that has occurred in most of social sciences, but in political theory it hasn't. On the historical basis, the Declaration gets used as a platform to explain why it is that the North American British colonies separated from Britain. And if you actually take it back, in a 12-year period or so, the founding, at least from my sense, can be divided more or less into two 12-year chunks. If we're trying to understand how we got to where we got to at the end when the Constitution was written. And the first 12 years of that chunk, which was a crisis or a continued set of problems that existed between the North American colonists and their British metropolitan colleagues, mostly in Parliament. And the story we tell is mostly a false one. And the Declaration is actually a transitional moment. It wasn't, in fact, the document that if you looked at or talked to, if you'd somehow gone back in history and talked to people in 1764 up until 1775, the Declaration wouldn't have been the document that they would have anticipated would be the outcome. Why does this matter? Well, the reality is that we tell a story that America knew where they were, and this has methodological elements too, which is we tell the story that the American founders, whomever that they might be, knew where they were going, knew what they wanted, and what they wanted was Republican government, which the Declaration does a great deal to defend and to set the course forward on. Well, the problem is the Republican government wasn't the goal. In fact, most American spokesmen, at least the ones most likely to be found in either of the Continental Congresses, actually had no desire for Republican government. Based on their fear and their understanding of Cromwell and the Civil War, that's what they most feared. They did not seek. So part of our self-understanding is that we were intentionally Republican. I just think is wrong. We did, and the Declaration does give voice to a view, an understanding that one could have found in the coffee shops of Philadelphia and New York circa 1765 or 1770, or in London. But it wasn't the dominant position. The dominant position in the North American colonies during this entire crisis was one that wanted to stay monarchical, wanted to stay close, in fact, closer to the king than maybe many in England would have anticipated, and that they did not want a republic because most of them feared democratic institutions when they're not, in fact, bound by their aristocratic or monarchical ones, both which were relatively weak in the colonies, but because of the continued connection to England, they felt a certain sense of security. With the Declaration, you get a new vision, but the vision wasn't intended. The vision was, in fact, a result, which is why in the book is written as a tragedy. Neither side got what they wanted, which was the continued relationship between the North American colonies and their metropolitan brethren in England. What the fight over and the Declaration does not accurately reflect, well, it does and it does not accurately reflect this. The fight was a fairly simple one. Should Parliament have the right to either tax for revenue or legislate domestically for the colonies? That's it. There was no consideration during 12 years. In fact, it wasn't until March or April of 1776 that there was any attack on the king. No one in the colonies, at least no one who had prominence, until a Tom Paine essay in January 8th, and he's British when he's writing, and radical in a way that one would find more common in London than you would in Philadelphia, is that no one would have challenged the idea that America was appropriately monarchical. In fact, they wanted to extend that. What the question was and what the issue was, and it continues today without much change, is about the nature of British legislative the nature of Parliament. Is Parliament an imperial body or a federal body, or is it something particular? And it's still the same debate that's occurring today between Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and England about the nature of Parliament. This was the debate, and there were solutions offered of an imperial federal system, but neither side was interested in hearing it, and neither side was able to find a path to solve the problem of how to deal with the issue of a diaspora of British settlers, which would be an ongoing issue and continues today.
Fascinating and provocative claims and observations that I want to unpack, because I know as a lot of people are listening to you talk about what does that mean they're pro-monarchical, what does that mean they weren't necessarily in favor of Republican government. But I want to bracket that for a moment. I want to come back to it, though, because it's obviously important, and it's important to people listening. But I want to think about the Declaration of Independence sort of as it is discussed, to the extent as it is discussed in American life today. And that is, we tend to only think about the initial claims in the document, which are natural rights claims, and the idea of equality that the Declaration embodies, a commitment of American constitutionalism to equality of individuals, and this should undergird and shape the way we think about our republic going forward. And yet you've written a book in the title, The Declaration of Independence in Historical Context. So I'm interested in getting your thoughts, because this must have been a part of your mind in setting forth to compile and produce this book, that somehow in America today what matters really is this sort of brief natural rights claim, and not, say, the list of grievances in the Declaration of Independence, which, to my mind, if we're thinking historically and we're walking in their shoes, would have been much more immediate and real to their experience to watch their, and as you talk about, their rights as British subjects, their constitutional rights, as they believe them to be trampled upon by Parliament. They would have felt that intensely. There's that claim going on in the document. There's a self-governing claim. It seems to me, maybe we can disagree about that in terms of what the Continental Congress is debating to get to the final product. All of those things seem to be working, and yet we remember one part of it. I'm curious to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, this it's actually the second paragraph that people have attended to, but at the time, it was the least attended to. When the British responded to the Declaration, about the only paragraph they didn't respond to, because they viewed it as boilerplate, which is the second paragraph. The issue, as I understand it, it has something of the following character. The debate that went on for 12 years and the debate that would follow after the Declaration was a debate that was not...
When you say 12 years, you're dating from 1765, 1764, the Stamp Act crisis, the beginning of the Stamp Act crisis. Okay, and let's come back to that in a minute. Okay.
Well, but the 12 years before and the 12 years after the Declaration, all the debate is consistently constitutional. The Declaration is anomalous. It's both the beginning of something which has unforeseen consequences which no one quite really fathomed, and to the degree they did, many of them were concerned about what the kind of corrosive effects of some of that language was, but they found it necessary. The debate for 12 years was entirely about, the issues and the debate were entirely constitutional. The North American colonists and the metropolitan British actually agreed on political theory and philosophy exactly, except to some degree that Americans may have been somewhat more atavistic, somewhat more old-fashioned on a number of levels, and also more royalist. But the issues that were confronting them and the problems they were trying to solve weren't ones of what is the right relation between man and his political entity, what is the way one should govern. They agreed on all those issues in terms of what we'd call political theory. What they couldn't understand or they didn't know how to solve, and their conundrums were all constitutional. And what would follow after the Declaration was the same problem. The colonies in Britain had two basic constitutional issues. None of them had anything to do with political theory or philosophy, which is what the Declaration is concerned with, and I'll explain in a moment why it is. But the issues that confronted them were both constitutional. One was an imperial question, which was how do you deal with multiple semi-sovereign legislative bodies in one large overarching polity, and what is the relationship of each of them to the imperial center? That would be a problem that would be solved by the Revolution because they would just separate them. The other problem, which wouldn't be solved, if at all, until the federal Constitution, and then maybe not until the Civil War, was what is the relationship simply in North America between the separate entities, the states, what we would come to call states, earlier colonies, and some sort of centralized government in North America. The colonies resisted both equally, and they had no more interest in having a Washington or a Philadelphia and New York overseeing and intruding than they had in London doing so. That problem wouldn't be solved again until at least at the earliest 1777, maybe not until 1787, and maybe again not until 1861. But these were both two constitutional issues. The question about the Declaration, which makes it anomalous, is that, in fact, the discourse that had made sense and was part, and only could have been part of the conversation between Britain and the North American colonies, was about British constitutionalism. And you had three constitutions that were being bandied about and disagreed about. One was an English constitution, which no longer existed, at least in actual practice. There's something we might call a British constitution circa 1760. And then there were multiple, or at least one or more, imperial constitutions. This is the only debate. But when you severed, or when finally the colonists, or at least a majority of them in Congress, felt that they no longer felt that they could find some sort of outcome of compromise between them and Parliament, or more importantly, them and their king, when that arrived at, the language of constitutionalism made no sense any longer. They had to shift to a different language, and the only language that was available for the kind of activities they had in mind were ones of natural rights, natural law, and, if you will, international law, which is and always has been a language of natural law. This is the language they wrote. The Declaration is a brief to the world, as much as, which is the first paragraph explains, a brief to the world to explain why they were legitimate in separating themselves from the king, to whom they had previously, at least until December 22nd in the American Prohibitory Act, which was arrived in the colonies in late February, when the debate changed really significantly. They had owed loyalty to the king because he protected them. With the American Prohibitory Act, he removed them from his protection, and they no longer owed him any allegiance. This is what the Declaration is explaining, why they were legitimate in what they were doing, all the grievances that they racked up and brought to bear against the king, not Parliament, because Parliament, they believed, they never had any relationship to of the kind that Parliament believed in. But the language of the Declaration is a language that, in fact, was appropriate for that moment, and almost immediately, and this is why in the book I continue on to 1777, Congress forgets all that discourse and goes back to its normal language. And probably one of the most telling events was the effort by a group called New Hampshire Grants, what we would call Vermont, to seek entry into the colonial body that would become the United States. They argued, based on documents from the Continental Congress of May 15th and the Declaration of July 4th, that they had the right to join the Union. They represented the colonists living in Vermont, and that they wanted to have the right to choose their own government. The Continental Congress responded to them with this kind of amazement that they would take the Declaration's expansive language and actually try to use it to, in fact, guide politics.
So it's interesting, as I read that part of your introduction on the New Hampshire Grants, it seemed to reinforce something that I've long thought. There's a natural rights claim or conclusion in the Declaration, but we don't actually have this practice, at least in the period, of sort of embracing an Enlightenment natural rights methodology and understanding that conclusion. There may be other ways.
If Los Angeles said, "Look, we're a dominant Hispanic today. We want the right of self-determination. We're leaving the United States." Do you really think that most people in California, let alone the larger country, would go, "Oh, you're now expressing the idea that was expressed in the Declaration. We respect your right, and you can leave freely"?
No, but what I think would change, or what has changed, is there is a sort of a Lockean natural rights emphasis that has become more true in American life. Certainly more true in California.
But it's not even.
But it hasn't informed our political practice in the way in which, in a foundational way, although it has shaped a lot of the ways we think about our laws as they touch upon relational and religious institutions, it seems to me.
Well, but this is the issue, that the dominant discourse of the 12 years preceding the Declaration had nothing to do with individual rights. Zero. It's almost never even mentioned. The entire debate was about corporate rights. Does Parliament have the right to vote, a corporate body, to guide and legislate for the colonies, or do each of the legislative bodies, again a corporate entity, have the right to guide with the king, always with the king, those who in fact they're governing? The question about individual rights just never came up because the British or the English Constitution, and then the British would follow, had certain individual right claims that in fact were largely not at play. I mean, they were indirectly, because the question is, did these individual rights accompany the colonists when they migrated to the North American area? And that was under debate, but it really wasn't part of this issue.
Yeah, I want to come back in 1 second to some things you said earlier in the interview about the terms of the debate and what how the colonies understood themselves, et cetera. It is interesting though. You say individual rights never came up. But it does seem, particularly in a volume Liberty Fund publishes, to pat ourselves on the back again, the political sermons of the founding era, a number of the sermons in those volumes reference natural rights arguments and talking about abuses that the colonists are experiencing. And it seems to me if it's in the level of the sermons, that it's got to be circulating. It seemed to me, and it would seem to be in a lot of the colonies. I wonder if maybe there is a natural rights arguments going on at the time, but maybe more prevalent or balanced by British constitutional rights arguments as well.
Well, I mean, if we're going to have competition between Liberty Fund publications, I actually like the Heinemann Lutz because I think it does a far better job at capturing the totality and the complexity. My dissertation was actually on American political sermons, and some of the choices made in the Sandos was, I think, intentional selection bias, which is part, again, of the methodology. When you have thousands of things to choose from, the editor is invariably going to pick things that they may like. I think Heinemann and Lutz are much less guilty of selection bias than Ellis is, and this isn't meant to be critical of him, but he chose political sermons that were more congenial to him than ones that weren't. I actually think the totality is much less clear about what it is that, in fact, was under consideration. But again, I'm not suggesting that the natural rights discourse did not exist and had no influence. I mean, part of what makes the 1776 so interesting is the radical and rapid shift from a discourse that was largely controlled, largely kept under wrap, largely part of a radical population. It's like saying that we're going to turn to, I don't know, the Wall Street movement, the movement that, a couple of years ago, and say that that's the dominant discourse. Occupy
Wall Street.
Right, and say that that's the dominant discourse. It wasn't. But after the separation from Britain, which had been entirely where language had always been couched in terms of British or English rights, they made no sense any longer. And, of course, the other discourse that was already available, it wasn't the case that it didn't exist. Remember, the Civil War, I mean, in a ways that I don't think we fully comprehend any longer.
The English Civil War, or the Americans?
Yes.
Okay.
No, the English Civil War was in fact the dominant boogeyman in their minds, and the Civil War used language of republicanism and natural rights with abandon. It's not that this language didn't exist. It was viewed as a boogeyman. It was viewed as something that was difficult to control, which is part of the reason the Declaration has, in some ways, can be viewed as a potentially dangerous document by giving invocation, by giving the kind of powerful defense of a language. And at least from my mind, one of the things that the Declaration did is it tended to separate rights from duties in a way that would become controversial in the 19th century because people started, in fact, invoking that and using it in that term. The Declaration is a document that gives voice to radical proclivities, not only in the second paragraph. The other ones are all traditional English, basically claims about where the monarch had trespassed. That goes back to the Petition of Rights, the Declaration of Rights, 1628. I mean, it's almost all the concerns about what the king had done were tropes that, in fact, the English should use. But the second paragraph goes back to the Civil War. It uses a radical language, which I think invariably is relatively dangerous. But what clear was by 1770 or the year following the Continental Congress, they didn't make use of it. But it wouldn't stop people from, in the 19th and 20th centuries and 21st, making, in fact, full use of that language in ways that are difficult or almost impossible to control.
And of course, Thomas Jefferson, in reflection back on the natural rights language, said it was nothing out of the ordinary, but accorded with the harmonizing sentiments of the day.
I think he's exaggerating.
Yeah.
I think he's reflecting the view of again, we often think of North versus South, but if you actually look at the pattern of votes in the Continental Congress, and again, it would shift in terms of the Philadelphia Convention, they're not the ones we think of, is that North and South often voted together, and Virginia in particular voted almost entirely with New England. It was the middle colonies in South Carolina which opposed Virginia and North. But I'm not sure that, in fact, the kind of Enlightenment thinking that I think Jefferson and some in Virginia were party to was identical, though it had similarities to the Protestant Reformed thought of New England. But they had certain similarities.
I wanted to ask you, just thinking about, because the book is the historical context, and we haven't even mentioned that you lay out a series of documents that are predicated on the or the Continental Congresses that meet, the Stamp Act Congress, and then the First and Second Continental Congresses. And so we start with the Stamp Act crisis and the Declaratory Act. So we're going to just briefly illuminate why that kind of starts you on your historical journey with these documents, and why you think it's so significant to getting the history of the Declaration right.
Well, because, again, I generally view the founding as these two, chunks of 12 years, and the debate that, in fact, is occurring in England and in the colonies has to do with the relationship between the colonists and Britain. And the debate is a relatively simple one, but it's one that we view as somewhat historically obscure. It had to do with the nature of dominions versus the realm.
Okay. Yeah.
The Parliament, and again, it can be very complicated or it can be very simple depending on your level of analysis. But Parliament's basic claim is that after 1649 and 1689, that the king's dominions no longer existed outside of the British kingdom eventually after 1707, but it was absorbed into England. It was absorbed into the crown. And if it's part of the realm or part of the crown, it is under parliamentary sovereignty, under parliamentary direction. If, on the other hand, and this is, again, a debate that is ongoing today with Scotland and England, in terms of the British character. The Welsh, more or less, weren't so much at issue. But even back then, the Scotch and Irish were trying to figure out what is the proper constitutional relationship between them and Parliament. And in Ireland, it would shift almost every, in what would be the solution in the 1770s, would change in the 1780s, and again, it would change in 1800 in terms of that relationship. But the issue was that the colonies believed that they were part of the king's dominions, which means that they were directly under some feudal tie, and I mean feudal, a feudal tie to the king, which had no relationship to Parliament. They weren't part of Parliament's overarching, except to the degree that Parliament could legislate for the commercial and navigation laws that were part of how the empire would exist, but only in a very narrow set of things having to do with maritime activities and a few economic activities. But anything to do with internal matters, they never doubted the king had a perfect right to intervene. The laws about suspending acts were always fought, but nevertheless accepted. But they understood that they were the kings, the same way that the king's land in Hanover were the kings. But they also knew well from their actual experience is that they had a great deal of control over the king's representatives, most importantly the governor, because how weak they were. So the colonies had this kind of, and this is where Jack Green and others and I disagree, is Jack emphasizes a practical imperial constitution where he draws attention, and rightly so, that in almost every instance the colonies had greater power or leverage over the governors, though they didn't have theoretical leverage. They were subordinate. But when push come to shove in practice, they had the money, they had the power, and they had the numbers to more or less frequently awe the governors to get them to act in ways. And that's part of what's going on here, is that the shift is occurring that Parliament's now trying to exercise power, trying to, in fact, add to the king's capacity in the colonies to govern, create some sort of central administration. This largely was a result, or at least in part was given greater emphasis after the 7 years or 9 years or French and Indian Wars, all different names, because the colonies had acted so idiosyncratically and so individually that there was a recognition, and this goes back to the Albany Congress in 55, where Franklin and Hutchinson started the movement towards some sort of federal imperialism, is how do you get the states or colonies to act in concert, particularly against foreign enemies? And they didn't. They acted generally on a selfish basis. Whenever the enemy was close, they responded. When they were far, they tended to lose interest. Britain, this is one of the things that I found striking, is that Britain had a greater interest in protecting most of the elements in its empire, and this gave them a certain kind of liberal coloration which we just ignore. They were the ones interested in protecting Native Americans. They were the ones trying to, in some sense, improve African American situation or the slave population. They were the ones that were trying to protect Catholics in Quebec. The colonists were uninterested in any of those things. It's striking how much more we would call the term liberal the British imperial officers were than their colonial counterparts.
In thinking about this debate between the colonies and Parliament and the King, and thinking about how was the Declaratory Act received, and the Declaratory Act follows almost in time with the repeal of the Stamp Act by Parliament. The Declaratory Act being where Parliament rules it has the absolute right to rule in the colonies. Are there? And I'm thinking also about an earlier claim you made that they weren't necessarily interested in Republican government during this 12-year period from the Stamp Act crisis to the Declaration of Independence. The colonists were not, if I heard you correctly. But I'm wondering if it seems to me there's something crucial about the way the Declaratory Act is received in shaping the Declaration of Independence in historical context. That being that the colonies understand themselves as self-governing, but under the king. So it's not that they're necessarily pro-monarchical, which is another claim that you made, and I'm just thinking about that, if we can contrast that, because I'm pro-monarchical, but it's because you let me be self-governing. I can look back, many of the colonies can, to a charter from the king, and you're letting me do what I want to do, and I've got this practice now, self-governing, and you're now at least saying you have the authority to wipe that away, potentially. It seems to me it's almost are the colonists saying you're bringing in a different type of law. It's the law of the Stuarts. It's not say the 1688 British Constitution of the rule of law or something along those lines of a British Constitution that they could actually identify with. But there's a lot of other things that you're now claiming, which I just reject.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of truth to this. What you argue is that from the colonist position, it was Parliament that was, in fact, radical in trying to make changes. But let's go back to the Declaratory Act. It's actually fairly interesting that the Declaratory Act of '66 was almost identical to the one that, in fact, was, I remember, 1619 or 1620, or maybe 1621, that was over Ireland. The language is 95% identical, except that in the '66 Declaratory Act, Parliament adds intentionally that, in fact, the colonies are under not just the king, but under the king and Parliament. And that's the only change between the two acts that they'd imposed on Ireland in 50 years, I guess, I'm not going to come up with the numbers quickly, but what they'd imposed on Ireland, and then they imposed on the colonies. The act is identical. So, I mean, again, this is part of the imperial character of the issues that they were confronting. The colonies view the actions of Parliament as, in fact, trying to create something new, and there's a great deal of truth to that. Parliament's moving in two directions, and again, it has a certain kind of overlap with what would occur in the constitutional period in the United States. They're trying to do at least two things. One is they're trying to centralize authority and gain greater control over their imperial holdings, in particular North America, which the North American legislative bodies found really unacceptable. Remember, again, with the king, they were able to largely, I'm trying to find the right word. They couldn't control, but they largely could manage the governors pretty well because, again, their lack of
the royal governors. These were royal governors. Okay.
They had very little power, both monetary and political. And the legislatures almost invariably had far more power. The Privy Council was a different matter, but we'll leave that aside for a minute. And what Parliament's trying to do is centralize, strengthen. It goes back to the Andros administration and what they tried to do in New England at the end of the 17th century. There was a constant sort of effort to reform the empire, which, of course, the colonists found and resented. No more or no less than they resent any effort from on the American side to create a centralized government. What also is going on in England, and which makes me think that the American constitutional system is far less progressive, far less modern than we understand, is that in Parliament, and in relation between the King and Parliament, there's a movement towards what we would call responsible party government. The American constitutional vision is mostly, as you said, one that was guided by a kind of atavistic attitude, which was a product of the Glorious Revolution, which is legislative opposition to an executive. Part of the dysfunction of Washington today can be directly traced to our confusion back in 1770s. And it's not just the one that we were alone in. I mean, Burke was one of the great advocates, among others, of this oppositional adversarial system between a largely monarchical executive and an elective legislature. By the 1760s in England, 1770s in particular, George III had already begun moving towards a kind of party government which understood and accepted the role of party, and where the executive no longer was in oppositional standing to legislature. They were modern. Our constitutional system is reactionary. It's going back to a vision which is largely tied, again, to the kind of culmination of the Glorious Revolution, where the king was to be constrained by a legislature, not to, in fact, be one where they worked together. George III was largely in control of but not entirely. But he had begun to develop a system where, in fact, you had a prime minister. It used to be called the prime minister starts becoming a party functionary in a way that, in fact, would be the future. But the American constitutional system is based really on the Glorious Revolution's understanding between a monarch and a legislature, not a modern one, a responsible party, where the executive and legislature work in common, and when the people, the electorate, finds them equally dissatisfying, they, in fact, boot them all, both out. Our system is, again, this is part of what I keep harping back to. We just don't understand both the importance of the colony's interest in maintaining, and when I said that a monarchical government, it wasn't an absolute, it was a constitutional monarchical government where the king's role was well-defined, legally limited, but one that had certain prerogatives. And they thought that, when you look through the records of the Federal Convention in 1787, and it's, I think, not fully understood or sufficiently appreciated, is how many people, not just Alexander Hamilton, though he's the most famous, continued to believe that the best government in the world was Britain. They didn't believe necessarily that they could do so because of different conditions in the colonies and then the states, but there was no doubt from, in their minds, at least a significant minority, if not a majority, that the best government in the world was Britain, and it was a constitutional monarchy.
That's an interesting claim in its own right, because it would seem to me that they would necessarily start with the view that this is that the British monarchy is a good government, and then they're going to sort of shape it around or start to pull powers out that they don't want to see expressed in their constitution, or to the extent they're thinking about the British Constitution. Again, it would seem to me it's not the model that seems to conceive of law more as a modern forceful will, but going back maybe even to the medieval or to what the ancient British Constitution, which seems to be that it harkens back to a more pre-modern understanding of constitutionalism.
No, that's the difference between the British and English constitutions, and the colonists were found far more congenial. The English Constitution, where legislative body had natural constraints, they couldn't make 2 and 2 equal 5. But the British Constitution circa 1770, the British Constitution of Blackstone, could make 2 and 2 equal 5. Yeah. And the colonists were found far more congenial. Not all of them. Hutchison maybe wasn't one who did, but the vast majority were far closer to and far more attached to the English Constitution. The changes that occurred in the 18th century, both in terms of the increasing power of Parliament, its capacity to be unconstrained, which still exists today, by the way. English Parliament does not have any natural constraints. When our but again, this goes to my mind, back to my point, that the American constitutional system is closer to 17th century England, and particularly that of the Glorious Revolution, than it is of 18th century Britain, and or as you move forward to responsible party governments that are associated with in fact, parliamentary systems rather than presidential. The presidential system is far closer to a monarchical/legislative constitutional system than it is a parliamentary one, where Parliament...
I see your point. Thinking about, so the documents you select leading up to the Declaration of Independence, and then you've got Act 5, which is the period after the Declaration, and so the documents you've selected help us understand the debates in these colonial congresses, continental congresses. But one question is something you said earlier: they weren't interested in Republican government. I guess I'm struggling with that a little bit. Maybe you can flesh that out. Why? But isn't the fact that they understand themselves to be self-governing in their states? There's a state constitutional activity in 74 and 75 and 76, particularly in Virginia. There's these continental congresses. Isn't there some striking commitment here to being self-governing that the colonists understand?
Well, I guess this becomes a sort of debate about words.
Okay. Okay.
I mean, what I'm claiming is that they did believe that the popular element in government was both essential and important, but it needed to be constrained.
Okay.
That's not Republican. It's not Republican circa Cromwell, and it's not Republican circa the English Civil War. The English Civil War is that the popular element is the only element, and it's the only one that is, in fact, dispositive. I mean, what makes the Constitution interesting, and what makes, in some ways, the debates that one associated with the 1780s interesting, is the basic problem, not the solution, but the basic problem that, in fact, the framers of the Constitution confronted was what to do with only having one element of the three that they all believed necessary for good government.
Yeah.
They didn't have a solution. They ended up coming up with a kind of Enlightenment mechanical solution to the basic conundrum they had, is they didn't actually have the organic estates that are naturally opposed to each other. So they had to come up with a model, a mechanical model, almost a Newtonian model.
Super majoritarianism, deliberative consent at every level, trying to stave off pure majoritarianism.
It's not just pure majoritarianism. The problem is when you only have popular government. That was the problem. I mean, republicanism to them wasn't the solution. It was the, if you will, the conundrum, even almost the disease that they had to cure, because from their point of view, their antecedent event that was most important to them was the Civil War, which was a pure republicanism, and it was a disaster from most of their minds. That was the problem they had to confront. The solution in England was one of monarchy, the one, the few, and the many, in a balanced equipoise, one against the other, with the popular side being a very powerful and very important, but not capable of acting alone, because their view is democracy. I mean, democracy is a pathology. From the traditional point of view, democracy is the rule of the poor and the weak, and it's not a balanced government. It needs to be constrained. The problem that the framers confronted is they didn't have the organic elements necessary, at least in traditional discourse, to balance the many. So they end up coming with a mechanical design of, as you were mentioning, a mechanical design that would allow them to create the positive consequences of balance without having the organic elements that they thought or had thought necessary.
No, that's well said. I want to maybe end, and we can get really deep here. But I'm thinking about the title of your book, The Declaration of Independence, in historical context, and laying out a way of understanding the Declaration in the context of political debates and constitutional debates in the period. Why would it necessarily be wrong for a constitutionally minded people like Americans to pull different parts of the Declaration for meaning going forward? That is to say, one question would be, a significant question would be here, why isn't the second paragraph now sufficient to understanding the Declaration? Because this is how we choose to constitute ourselves. Do you understand what I'm saying? I mean, why is the authority of history so weighty here?
Well, it's a good question, and I think in some ways you maybe hit the nail on the head of what the debate is about. I think at the end of the day, what we need to view, or at least to consider, is what was the role of the Declaration at the time? How was it, in fact, constructed? What kind of investment did people place in it that were, in fact, responsible for its passage? And I think that what we've done is we've created, look, every polity almost certainly has founding myths and narratives which are over time viewed as somehow essential to the story we want that any people wants to tell about themselves. And the Declaration has taken on this role. I think ultimately the Declaration, when written, had none of these aspirations, none of these claims about its historical importance. I mean, it was ignored until Jefferson's run in 1800. It just didn't have any interest, or it was viewed more important outside of the colonies or the early United States than it was inside. It principally was a document that had important contemporary purposes. It separated the colonies from Britain before the Howe Peace Commission arrived, which is really, really important, because when they meet with Howe, they go, oh, it's too late now. We've already, in fact, separated. We can't undo this. Mm-hmm. Yeah. The timing was essential. The language that they produced at the time, when Jefferson said it was in the air, it was in the air as a certain kind of discourse for a certain kind of purpose, and it was a language that would fit for an international regime, not for a domestic one. It had no application to domestic politics. When the New Hampshire grants and others tried to use it in terms of domestic politics, they were basically ignored. They were viewed as, in fact, something close to insane. It had a particular application. Those today who want to turn the Declaration into something more than it was at the time do so with a political or philosophical agenda. I suppose I might be guilty of the same, that the reason I want to de-emphasize, I think historically it's both accurate and I'm acting in accord with the best factual materials I have. But still the question is, what motivates me to care? Yeah, and my motivation, I can be honest in saying that my motivation is that I find that the second paragraph of the Declaration is not congenial, is not, in fact, something that, in fact, is helpful to the constitutional government of America. I think that the Declaration begins patterns that are, to my mind, rather dangerous. Most importantly, it does two things. It separates the relationship between rights and duties, which I view as a particularly difficult and not helpful and not welcome change, and it basically begins to differentiate and collapse the difference between natural rights and civil rights, because and probably at least until the mid-19th century, the dominant understanding was that when you entered society, whatever natural rights you acquired, you surrendered them for a far more secure but different and delimited set of civil rights. The Declaration helps to begin the erosion of that distinction so that people can make claims that that their natural rights were never limited, and natural rights were always used as a language that was pre-civil intentionally, and that when you entered society, they became shaped and limited by the needs as well of the individual as is the society. So, I suppose if I'm being honest, and I suppose this is a moment to be so, part of my efforts on the historical side is to draw attention to the Declaration, to limit its appeal, and to constrain its effects, because I think they're not necessarily all that advantageous.
Barry Shain, thank you so much for your time today. We've been talking with the editor of the new book, The Declaration of Independence in Historical Context. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
This is your host, Richard Reinsch, and you have been listening to a podcast that can be found at libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, and find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org.